thank you for joining. My name is Jennifer Hill, an education specialist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. In addition to hosting broadcasts, I have the honor of coordinating the Native Youth Climate Adaptation Leadership Congress, a week-long on-site program for Indigenous high school youth to grow in leadership, which we welcome you to learn more about. Before moving into our broadcast, I would like to acknowledge that the National Conservation Training Center is located on the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. While we could not find a full account, we are aware that many peoples traversed, cherished, and lived on this land. They include the Massawamek, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. As we learn more about the Indigenous people who continue to have relationships with this land, we better appreciate the good earth on which we work, live, and learn. And we pledge to grow and sustain relationships with Indigenous communities through collaboration on our training, outreach, youth programs, museum exhibits, and more. But most importantly, we encourage others to learn more about the land on which they work and reside. Today, we are going to look at the film Remembered Earth in honor of Navarre Scott Momaday, followed by a discussion with John Grabowska. Before we begin the film, a little bit about John Grabowska, who will then talk about Momaday. Documentarian John Grabowska makes films that have won awards around the world and are broadcast nationally as primetime specials. He has lectured on natural history filmmaking at the National Geographic Society and the Smithsonian Institution. He's led environmental media workshops in Argentina and Panama, co-founded the American Conservation Film Festival, and is a Smithsonian Journeys Expert. The Washington Post calls him one of the virtuoso environmental filmmakers in the country. John, I'll now hand it over to you to talk about Momaday.
Thank you very much, Jen. N. Scott Momaday is best known for winning the 1969 Pulitzer Prize for fiction for his novel Housemaid of Dawn. But Scott was much more than simply a Pulitzer Prize winner. He was an artist, a poet, an interpreter of Indigenous oral history. He was a memoirist, a scholar, a professor. And I first came in contact with him or was exposed to him a few years before I made this film. I was making a film in Alaska, and in the research I was reading Barry Lopez's Arctic Dreams, and the epigraph was a quote from Scott's book, The Way to Rainy Mountain. And I thought it was such a striking quote interpreting our relationship with the land, Aldo Leopold's land, the landscape, that I thought I've got to incorporate it into this film. But filmmaking, like any other art, is an organic process. Things end up on the cutting room floor. They take you in directions you sometimes don't expect. But I took that quote and put it in my little magpie pouch of shiny things and thought maybe it'll come in handy in a later film. So then I was making this film on Northwest New Mexico, and I was searching for some kind of interpretive vehicle to tell the story, because natural history films, unlike historical documentaries, do not have a built-in story. There is no beginning, middle, and end. And I thought maybe I could draw on Momaday's writings and possibly have him participate, because he has a beautiful stentorian voice. He's a natural actor, or he was. He died in January at age 89. So I conceived of this idea of using his quote and even titling the film from this quote. And I will read it from The Way to Rainy Mountain, which is an oral history of the Kiowa. He was a Kiowa Indian, and their migration from the northern plains to the southern plains. And the quote reads, "Once in his life, a man ought to concentrate his mind upon the remembered earth, I believe. He ought to give himself up to a particular landscape in his experience it, to look at it from as many angles as he can. And it continues. As I was writing the script, I reread this beautiful quote and thought, once in his life, a man ought to contemplate the remembered earth. And I realized there goes half my audience. I was raised by a very strong woman, and I could just imagine how she would have reacted. She would have thought, oh, this film is not for me, it's for a man who's contemplating. So I knew I could not use the quote as written. So I called Scott, who had already agreed to participate, and said, Mr. Pulitzer Prize winner, giant of American letters, would you mind if I rewrote some of your work? And I was half expecting him to dismiss me summarily, and that would have thrown the whole film into, it would have been sabotaged. I don't know what I would have done. But to his credit, he graciously said, what do you have in mind? And I said, I would simply like to change the third person singular, a man, he, his, to the first person plural, we, so that it includes everybody, but it also invites the audience to participate actively in the film from the very beginning. And Scott not only liked the idea, he paid me the greatest compliment my writing has ever received. He said, I think it's an improvement. And the rest, we went on to make the film, and you'll note that from the opening of the film, Scott's good nature, generosity, and graciousness in allowing me to edit his already published works. So, Remembered Earth, New Mexico's high desert.
Once in our lives, we ought to concentrate our minds upon the remembered earth. We ought to give ourselves up to a particular landscape in our experience. To look at it from as many angles as we can. To wonder about it. To dwell upon it. We ought to imagine that we touch it with our hands at every season and listen to the sounds that are made upon it. We ought to imagine the creatures there and all the faintest motions of the wind. We ought to recollect the glare of noon and all the colors of the dawn and dusk.
This landscape has borne many names. Indian country, the Big Empty, the high dry, the land of room enough and time enough. Within this immense land lie areas falling under more specific taxonomies, according to the mindset of those naming them. El Mal País, the checkerboard res, the sacred turquoise mountain, the Grants Mineral Belt. Bounded by the Chusca Mountains, the San Juan River, the Sierra Nacimiento, and the Mogollon Rim, northwest New Mexico is a high desert plateau, bisected by the Continental Divide. All of it well over a mile high and still gently rising. This vast expanse of plateaus and mesas, mountains and bluffs, cliffs and canyons presents an iconography of the American West, past, present, and future. It is so archetypal a landscape that Hollywood has used it almost as a character in dozens of Western films, burning these images into our collective memory.
For the European who came from a community of congestion and confinement, the West was beyond dreaming.
It must have inspired him to formulate an idea of the infinite. Here, he could walk through geologic time.
If you stand on the edge of this valley and look across space to the great volcanic towers that stand away in the silence, you will understand how it is to grasp the notion of eternity. At some point along the line of your sight, there is an end to time, and you see beyond into timelessness.
Scale is confounded in this fractal landscape, where the structural elements of the earth are exposed to the open sky. Geologists have assigned to the landscape a bewildering list of otherworldly names: diatremes, laccoliths, upwarps, Mars, cinder cones. In the midst of this high desert, signs of water are evident in the evolution of rock. Red rock cliffs are the relics of massive sand dunes from the Jurassic. Sea life from ancient oceans transformed into limestone. Coastal plant life was pressed into seams of uranium and beds of coal. Long after the oceans receded, volcanic power built up and then blew the top off Mount Taylor. Through a less explosive process, volcanism also gave birth to the giant black lava flows stretching to the horizon, a jagged and twisted moonscape known as El Malpais. Subterranean lava flows created a labyrinthine cave system stretching for miles beneath the desert. In such a geologic landscape, it often seems that life cannot find a foothold, that only rock is real.
It all sounded so exciting. Nurse for the railroad, new frontiers, the romantic West.
I got a sneaking suspicion you like your East better than the West.
Like it? But there's no comparison. All you've got here is miles of rocks and desert and hills with no trees.
Well, we've got a lot of wonderful...
Rattlesnakes.
Northwest New Mexico is a land of dry wind and sun, and of little rain. It receives about 10 inches of moisture per year, half in winter snowfall, half in summer thunderstorms. Tinajas are naturally occurring basins in sandstone. Rainwater that collects in these potholes serves as an oasis for many high desert reptiles and insects. Plants and animals have developed ingenious methods of ensuring survival. In an arid land, leaves evolved into smooth, hard spines as a defense against evaporation. Throughout the American West, non-native invasive trees like tamarisk, with its feathery leaves, have crowded out native cottonwood and willow, sucking many rivers and streams dry. Animals adapt by conserving energy during the heat of the day. The scarcity of life in the desert is deceptive. Despite the wilderness of rock, there is a startling diversity in plant and animal species, granted a generous gift of space in this vast land. The reason for the biodiversity is elevation. It was in the desert Southwest that the concept of life zones was developed. The idea of a virtual journey from Mexico to Canada simply by going uphill from desert floor to alpine peak. Isolated mountain ranges rise like islands from the desert sea below.
The character of the landscape changes from hour to hour, day to day, season to season. Nothing of the earth can be taken for granted. You feel that creation is going on in your sight. You see things in the high air that you do not see farther down in the lowlands. In the high country, all objects bear upon you, and you touch hard upon the earth. From my home, I can see the huge billowing clouds. They draw close upon me and merge with my life.
There's our stop up ahead, right by Inscription Rock.
Aki.
The hand of humankind has been present in northwest New Mexico for millennia, sometimes with a light and mysterious touch in a beautiful but grudging homeland. Chacoan Indians, Spanish missionaries, Hispano settlers, Anglo homesteaders. The merciless heat of the desert preserves the remains of every culture. The lost stories of nameless people are presented equally under the impassive sky. In the desert, hardship becomes ordeal, and reality drives romance into full retreat. Even within protected areas and wilderness, this land is not pristine. It has been used, and used hard. Once a breadbasket of New Mexico, the Rio Puerco Valley has been described as a monument to overgrazing. The stream provides only 6% of the Rio Grande's flow, but more than half of its silt. The Four Corners region has been called a national sacrifice area to the nation's power grid, supplying oil, gas, uranium, and coal. The Zuni Mountains were once clear-cut for railroad ties. For many who live here, this land is sacred. Landscapes have histories which are uncovered not only in the traces of human life, but in the history of ways of seeing the land.
I am interested in the way that we look at a given landscape and take possession of it in our blood and brain. None of us lives apart from the land entirely. Such an isolation is unimaginable. If we are to realize and maintain our humanity, we must come to a moral comprehension of earth and air as it is perceived in the long turn of seasons and of years.
The visitor to northwest New Mexico sees a land of American myth and memory, of cowboys and Indians, canyons and rimrock, trains across the continent. That romance is real. A closer, longer, deeper examination reveals our role and responsibilities in a hard but fragile land. The history of land use here has been one primarily of extraction. Is it possible to extract something more than the physical from this desert landscape? Can we come to see land itself as a community to which we belong? Perhaps, in the attempt to take possession of the land, we are in some way possessed by it. Captivated by its history and its future.
There is great good in returning to a landscape that has had extraordinary meaning in one's life. There are certain villages and towns, mountains and plains, that having seen them, walked in them, lived in them, even for a day, we keep forever in the mind's eye.
They become indispensable to our well-being. They define us. And we say, I am who I am because I have been there.
It is here that I can concentrate my mind upon the remembered earth. It is here that I am most conscious of being. Here that wonder comes upon my blood. Here I want to live forever. And it is no matter that I must die.
I think I've watched that before, but I think I always need a second to compose myself at the end of that. Um, it just makes me a little emotional. It takes me back to, I love that quote, how it starts and ends with that, because it takes me directly, personally, to growing up on the sand flats of North Carolina with my great grandparents and grandparents and gardening. And that's exactly why I ended up where I am today. And I think those memories are, those place-based memories to Mother Earth are sustenance for people and help us get to where we are. So, yeah. Without me going into tears, we will go to questions.
Please indulge yourself. A filmmaker loves it.
No, let's see here. So I'm dueling two screens now. We've had lots of thank yous and hellos. Someone would like to know the source and credits. Oh, okay, so Pam, I think we can put that eventually on our, when we post it on our website, we'll add that information in there on our website with the source and the credits to that information.
Sure, I
and
can
just
talk
for everybody
a bit about that too.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, Momaday is probably best known for his Pulitzer Prize for fiction for Housemaid of Dawn, but he described himself, at least to me, more as a poet than as a novelist. And terrible confession, I was never able to finish Housemaid of Dawn. And Scott even said he didn't think it was his best work. He wrote it when he was 28, and he kept writing until he was about 88. Just published a book in 2020. So one would hope that a writer or a filmmaker or any artist improves with age, knowledge, and wisdom. But what I used for mining his writings for quotes, specifically about the land, he wrote about just about everything, but he kept returning to the uniquely indigenous relationship to the land. And so he wrote 2 or 3 memoirs that I relied heavily on. One is called The Man Made of Words. Another one is called The Names, a memoir. I don't have the most recent book here with me, but it is in a similar vein. It's about an indigene's relationship to the earth. So those were my, I like nonfiction anyway. I love his poetry. And, you can't even separate Momaday the poet from Momaday the nonfiction writer. His nonfiction writing is filled with poetic descriptions. One of the reasons that, in addition to his reputation, his writing, his stature, and that incredible voice, that I wanted to work with him is because he had a pan-Indian experience. This film is about a large, northwest New Mexico is a huge area. And there are Zuni Pueblos, the Navajo Reservation, the Jicarilla Indian Reservation, Laguna, Acoma. It is incredibly diverse in the native peoples who live there or here. I actually live here now. But Momaday, who was Kiowa, born to a Kiowa father and a part Cherokee mother in Oklahoma, had a pan-Indian upbringing. His parents were BIA teachers. His dad was an art teacher. His mom was a language arts teacher. And so they worked for the BIA all over the desert Southwest. So he grew up on the Navajo Reservation. His teen years were on Jemez Pueblo. his first job out of college. He went to the University of New Mexico. His first job was teaching on the Jicarilla Indian Reservation in Dulce. And of course, he traveled widely, was a professor at multiple universities. He ended his teaching career here in Santa Fe, teaching at IAIA, the what is International Indian American Arts Institute. And, you know, so I was working with him, finished a narration and said, just socially, well, we'll get out of your hair so you can prepare for class. And he laughed because he was 80 and said, I don't really need to prepare anymore. But IAIA is a really fascinating school that attracts Indian students, Native Americans from all over the country. Santa Fe, when it comes to its indigenous population, is incredibly diverse. There's a professor in the film department at IAIA who's a Tlingit from Juneau, Alaska. So that's one of the things I really appreciated about working with Scott was he wasn't coming from one indigenous, one tribal perspective. He was a worldwide expert on indigenous cultures.
So I'm curious, as you worked on this film, were you able to walk the lands with Momaday and explore them? And if so, what stood out to you?
We recorded him in his home up in Jemez Springs, which was, it's just a few miles north of where he spent his teen years on Jemez Pueblo. But by the time I was working with him, his health had started to decline, physical health, certainly not mental health. His acuity was incredible, but he walked with difficulty. And so rather than having him try to get into a studio, we went to his home to record him. But I definitely wanted to have him on camera, not just his voice, so you could see Navarre Scott Momaday, and obviously an indigenous man. As he said, you can see Asia and Beringia in my face. And so we took him just a few steps from his home to a state park in Jemez Springs, and wanted to have him out in the environment with those red rock cliffs behind him that he wrote about, where he lived at the time, where he had grown up. So we weren't really able to take him out on the land as much as I would have enjoyed hiking with him, but he was beyond hiking at that point.
I see. Okay. What was the most memorable part of working with Momaday that's resonated with you?
Well, that experience of asking to rewrite some of his words was a revelation for me as well. I've used that technique in every film since, using the third person plural, because it immediately invites the audience along on the journey. It immediately engages the audience. And I don't know if I would have stumbled upon that revelation myself, but working with him and just being so impressed with how generous and gracious he was. Not every writer would respond well if some young pup said, I want to change what has been printed, and you're world renowned, but I want to change it. But he was very open to it, just said, what did you have in mind? Liked the idea. I can tell a story about Momaday that leads into something I really enjoyed. His Kiowa name was Tsoai Tali, which translated literally into English, means rock tree boy. Now, the rock tree figures largely in his life because it's a place in eastern Wyoming where the Kiowa originally were. Those were their ancestral lands. And he wrote about the migration away from that to Oklahoma in the way to Rainy Mountain. But he was taken there as an infant and given that name. And it comes from a story, an oral history to the Kiowa tribe. And that was 8 Kiowa children were out on the high plains of eastern Wyoming, and 7 sisters and 1 boy. And for reasons known only to the Great Spirit decided to turn the boy into a bear. Fur started to grow. He went down on all 4s. His fingers elongated into claws. He started running around. And naturally, the 7 sisters were terrified and started to run, triggering the predator-prey response in the now bear boy. So the boy chased them. The Great Spirit looked down and said, whoops, I made a boo-boo, and lifted the 7 sisters up from the prairie. A rock tree grew right out of the land. And the bear reared up, clawed the sides of this rock tower, carving grooves into it. And then the Great Spirit decided there's nothing to eat. The girls will probably starve up there. And he lifted them, all 7 of them, into the sky, making them into stars of what we usually call the Big Dipper, but is also known as Ursa Major, the Great Bear. So Tsoai Tali was the name of that bear boy. So Momaday throughout his life and his career associated with the bear. He was, with a twinkle in his eye, he would say he's a shapeshifter. He wrote books about shape-shifting human and bears. So that was his totem, you could call it his spirit animal, but it actually was his name. So a few years later, I worked on another film in New Mexico with him. And then I was making a film on the Alaska Peninsula centered on Katmai National Park, which the Alaska Peninsula has more brown bears than people. 10,000 bears out there. If you spend any time on the peninsula and you do not see a bear, you're trying not to see a bear. So I was wondering, how am I going to tell this story? And I naturally thought of Scott. So I called him up and I simply said, Scott, it's John. Bears. And he immediately said, I'm in. What do you want me to do? So he is greatly missed. I mean, he was a giant of American letters. He was in poor health the last decade or so. For that Alaska film, I recorded him remotely, and he was in a wheelchair by then. And we had to edit out the squeaks of the wheelchair when he would shift his weight. But even as his body was failing him, his mind was not. He was so sharp. And one other thing I really loved about him, directing is hard. Even with professional actors, it's hard getting the performance that you really want. It was not hard with Scott. He was a natural actor. He took direction. He would think about, I'd say, can you try it a different way, different emphasis, slow it down, speed it up, and he could do it all. And not everybody can do that. Acting is difficult, but he made it seem effortless. It was a pleasure to work with him. Intellectually, creatively, he was funny, he was articulate, He was challenging, a fierce intellect. I just love the guy.
Thanks for sharing. I think we'll wrap up with one last question, which I think is a good question to wrap up with. What do you hope is the message that viewers of the film receive from the film?
Well, I put a line in the film that I paraphrased from Aldo Leopold, his seminal environmental book, Sand County Almanac. And what Leopold tried to impart was that we are, and this is actually something that most native tribes just know intuitively. They're brought up with it. It's part of the culture. And that is that we are not separate from the land. We're not apart from the land. My Western patriarchal culture has separated us from the land, and what Aldo Leopold described as the land included the wildlife, the soil, the air. And so I grew up in a similar situation that you did. My family was traveling out west, camping out west. My dad grew up in a ranching family. But that separation of our Western European, Anglo-American culture has created an artificial existence for us so that we exploit the land without even thinking about it. The pioneer American empire colonizing the American West was for extractive purposes, cutting down the forests, plowing up the prairie, digging coal, digging uranium, digging gold. And Leopold, I don't even know if he drew on indigenous sources for his philosophy or if he just absorbed it from osmosis, because his seminal experience was out here in New Mexico. You know, all of the Western Hemisphere is Indian country, but it's palpable here in the desert Southwest. So somehow reaching an audience to consider that we need to extract something more than the physical from this land, more than natural resources. The land itself is a natural resource for our mental health, for our physical health, for our spiritual health. So that's what I hope people will contemplate when seeing the film, and all my films.
All right. Thank you for sharing. I'm glad you spelled that out a little bit. I was educated under the Leopold world myself as a forester, so I got a little nervous because that gives me a bad vibe. Because I lean towards the ways of giving back to Mother Earth. So I'm glad you spelled that out a little bit because I was getting nervous there for a second. But that's my own personal bias, mind you.
Sure. Well, I hope
So
I would encourage
appreciate
anybody watching, and we can put it on the website as well, to shameless plug, go to johngrabowska.com, and all my films are available for free to watch. And you know, they're on different areas of the country, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Alaska, New Mexico, and I'm eager to make more, but they will continue to try and communicate that ethos, that environmental encouragement to consider our place in the land in a way that's more than simply consumptive and extractive.
Thank you, John. And yeah, I believe when we do post this, we will add the website for John's website so you can see where his films live. And I did want to let folks know, I know people have been reaching out We are experiencing a delay in posting because we're working on contracting. So bear with us while we work out our contracting issues. We will get things posted on our website. But if you're looking for something specifically to share with staff or a specific event, reach out to me and I'll try to get you a link that is not for public use. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there because I know several people have been reaching out for specific links. And I just want to thank everyone for being with us today. John, I really want to thank you for sharing your time with us today and sharing stories about Momaday and the time you spent working with him. We hope that everyone can join us next month. We will be holding our Indigenous broadcast series the third Wednesday of April. The topic is yet to be determined. It will be a surprise. And as a reminder, each broadcast is recorded and available on our website once we figure out our contracting issues. And if you wish to learn more about the broadcast series or to be added to the listserv, just reach out to me. My email is Jennifer_Hill, that's HILL, @fws.gov. And we welcome your broadcast suggestions and connections. Always looking for those. So please reach out to me with any of those things. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.